Hey guys, so we haven't done one of these introductory videos for a while, largely because we spent the last 9 weeks working through Dante's Divine Comedy. So some of you may be liking that we're taking a break from that sort of thing after going through that for 9 weeks and are moving to some different terrain. Some of you may wish we were still back in Dante. I don't know. But anyways, so I kind of wanted to take this, like I said in class, I want to kind of take this lesson and use it to kind of discuss some things that you want to look at when approaching Canterbury Tales, since next time I want to get right into the stories, and also give you a brief setup for the basic format of Canterbury Tales. So, the setup of Canterbury Tales. So, the Canterbury Tales is what you might call, is what people call a framed story. And what basically that means is that there are stories that are being told in a larger context. So there's kind of like a big overarching story, and then there's mini stories within it. So the way that works in Canterbury Tales is that the basic setup is that you have, I believe it's 30, it might be 24, it's either 24 or 30. I'm pretty sure it's 30. I'm going to say 30. You can Google or fact check me if you want to. Basically, there are 30 travelers who are all going from Oxford to Canterbury on a religious pilgrimage. And it's a big group of 30 people, and while they're going along, the host of the party decides that each of them should tell a story. And actually, they should each tell multiple stories, that each person should tell each other in the group 2 stories on the way there and to Canterbury, and then 2 stories on the way back from Canterbury as a way of spending their time. And so the Canterbury Tales is basically all of those stories that these different travelers are then telling. That's why it's called a frame story, because it's not just there's stories within a story, so there's kind of a metafiction element. Now, so that's kind of the basic framework of what you're going to get in Chaucer. Now, one thing to mention is the fact that the Canterbury Tales here is very much unfinished. So if you do the math, 2 stories there, 2 stories on the way back for 30 characters means that you should have about 120 stories. Chaucer only wrote 24 of them because he died before he could finish it. So we have only part of what could have been a larger work, but was cut short by his death. Now, another term you should know with regards to the Canterbury Tales is that the Canterbury Tales is an example of what's called an estate satire. And an estate satire is a type of genre that was popular in the Middle Ages, and it essentially has to do with ways of satirizing the different various classes or estates that were present in the Middle Ages. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term estates, an estate was kind of what we today would call a social class. And so a lot of Canterbury Tales is kind of, we've got these 30 characters, and all these characters come from different walks of life. So we've got people who are noblemen, we have people who are peasants, we have people who are church members, we have people who are merchants, and everything in between. What Shakespeare's trying to do is that he kind of draws each character as a bit of a characterization. You may say that it's, what's the right term for this? You may say that, there's a specific term that I'm wanting. And now this is really awkward because I'm not remembering. A caricature. So in addition to be a bit of a characterization, it's a bit of a caricature with each individual in the party. But he does that in order that he can kind of satirize and ridicule some of the different estates. And since he ridicules all the estates and social classes, the idea is no one can get too mad at him because he's satirizing them along with their enemies. So that's kind of the basic framework for Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. Some specific things I want to talk about it. First, let's talk about the meta element. So like I said, we've got a bunch of stories in the midst of an overall story. And this makes it a bit difficult to decide how we're supposed to interpret each story. So for example, this year we've been talking a lot about the ways to interpret stories. Beginning with History of the Kings of Britain, was talking about the principles of poetic justice and stuff, and also in last class session talking about a story's theme, focusing, question, and message, and stuff like that. And normally we say that we can kind of look at poetic justice and the questions that are being asked in the story and get a good idea on what the author is trying to say. This is made a bit complicated in Canterbury Tales. And this is made complicated because the stories, all the mini stories, aren't being told by Chaucer. They're being told by these characters. So Chaucer kind of begins his book by saying, oh, I'm just a copyist. This was a real thing that actually happened. And, I'm just copying down things that real life people actually said, which of course is completely bogus. Chaucer wrote all of these. He kind of wants to, he's first kind of using this excuse as a way to be able to absolve himself, to say, look, if any of the stories had bad morals or something, I want to be able to keep my hands free of them. But another reason that he's doing this is he wants to make clear that the stories are coming from a perspective of the character. So for example, one of the stories we're reading for this time is The Wife of Bath's Tale. And one of the things that you're going to realize when you read about the Wife of Bath is that she is not a very moral character. She has been married to 5 husbands in the past, and I think each of them died, or was, I don't think any were, there may have been one that was legally divorced. I don't remember off the top of my head. I should. Anyways, so there isn't necessarily anything unlawful with what she's done. But when you look at her character, you get the sense that she's not a very moral character. And so that then makes it complicated. So when you're reading The Wife of Bath's Tale, there then becomes a question. Does Chaucer mean the message of the story, or is it just the wife of Bath who means it? So, for example, in The Wife of Bath's Tale, a lot of it has to do with gender relations in marriage, and the wife of Bath's view at all that men should be submitting to women and giving women sovereignty in marriage. So the question then becomes, is this just the wife of Bath's personal opinion, or is this Chaucer's opinion as a whole? And that's something that's very difficult to figure out, because Chaucer can say, look, I was just painting a character who's immoral, and this tells the story with an immoral point. And it's a bit... So all that is to say that it's kind of tricky to understand in Canterbury Tales what parts of it Chaucer means and what parts he's just trying to represent characters. And this is one of the reasons that the prologue is so important. So the prologue for Chaucer, you basically get an introduction to each of the 30 characters. And this is important because you want to be paying attention to the descriptions of the people, specifically the descriptions of the individuals whose stories we're going to be reading. Because this is Chaucer setting the stage. So that when you're reading their story, you can think, oh, this is the type of person who's telling the story. And you want to keep that in mind because the moral isn't completely Chaucer's point, it also has to do with the character. All that is to say is that Canterbury Tales is incredibly rich and incredibly complex, and there's a lot we can get out of it. Now, some other element to be aware of in the Canterbury Tales. You may notice that we are only reading selections from the Canterbury Tales, and that is for a very important reason, because some of the stories are kind of inappropriate. Actually, not just kind of. Some of the stories are legitimately inappropriate. Sometimes today we kind of have this view of, the types of comedy and TV shows that I watch today are so immoral. But back in the good classical days of Christendom, people never did these kind of stories. And if you read through all of Chaucer, or just read some specific stories in here, you'll realize that very quickly that's wrong. That Chaucer enjoyed his forms of dirty humor as much as a lot of people do today. And not to the extent that some people do today, but you can see the same root there. And so you should be aware that there are some stories in the Canterbury Tales that are like this. Now, I've specifically made sure that we are not covering any of those stories in class. So you don't need to be worrying that you're going to be getting any of those stories. But you should be aware of just Chaucer's times, that this is something that Chaucer includes in some of his stories that you should be aware of for understanding the work as a whole. And this kind of leads to the last thing that I want to talk about today, is that one of the major themes in Canterbury Tales is really a division between a love for the world and a love for God. And this is in a bit present in the framing, in that the travelers are beginning out at an inn, which is basically, in the medieval ages, kind of the embodiment of the secular world. But where are they going? Well, they're going to Canterbury on a religious pilgrimage. So they're beginning kind of in the world, but they're supposed to be moving to God. One of the things that you'll notice in this book is that there's a lot of tension in many places between characters who love the world and characters who love God. Some commentators have said that you can basically put all of the different characters here on a spectrum, with how much they're loving the world and how much they're loving God. You can see each one kind of filling out his little role in this. So in the stories, another thing you're going to want to watch out for is this tension between the love of the world and the love of God. And I think this is part of the reason that Chaucer includes some inappropriate humor in this book, because Chaucer himself is wrestling with this. He feels the tension between his own love for the world and his own love for God. And so that means that some of the stories are very moral, and some of the stories are very much less than moral. Which is part of the reason why you might see at the end of Canterbury Tales, you may see that Chaucer has basically what he calls a retraction, where he says that, look, if I said anything inappropriate, or let me get the exact phrasing, he says, if there be anything that displeases my reader, I beg them to impute it to the fault of my want of ability and not to my will, who would very gladly have said better if I'd had the power. Now, this isn't a full apology, because he's saying, well, it's just because I don't know how to do it well. The problem isn't in my desire. But you do get a bit of apology here, because he realizes that there's this tension. And he wants to explain that, look, I'm trying to do... He's trying to navigate what it means to be in the world and not of the world. And so he's apologizing that, you know what, sometimes he's going to fail. But sometimes he's going to succeed. So as you're reading this, I want you to be keeping 1 John 2 in mind. What does it mean to be in the world but not of the world? This is a big question that's posed in Canterbury Tales. And I look forward to discussing this in The Wife of Bath's Tale and The Franklin's Tale with you on Friday next week when we discuss it. So, see you guys then.